So now we're delighted to have Nick Scott-Ram up here. He's the Director of Commercial Development at the Oxford AHSN, where he's responsible working and connecting, I guess, the industry, the NHS, academic partners, and commercialize new innovations in those settings. So without further ado, please start.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk about a slightly different topic from what's gone before, which is the question of open innovation versus what I would closed innovation, or that innovation which is protected by intellectual property one way or another. So I'm going to start talking about the focal point, which is to do with work being done at the Structural Genomics Consortium, which is based here at the University of Oxford. And it's been my privilege to be in connection with Professor Chaz Bouncer and Lee Wenhua. And Chaz, I know, will be speaking tomorrow, so he'll be giving a slightly different perspective. What I'm going to talk about today is around the intellectual property issues and some of the challenges that we're thinking about around open innovation and how to commercialise and do drug development. So the Structural Genomics Consortium, I think it's fair to say, is a world leader in open innovation. And the focus of what it's been trying to do is to generate a more efficient approach to drug discovery and drug development. One of the challenges, if you look over the last 20 to 30 years, is a decrease in the number of new medicines that are produced, rising costs associated with drug development, around a landscape where many companies are struggling to find new breakthrough products. So the SGC operates an open model for drug discovery, where basically everything is shared. There's no IP generated. All the reagents, all the information about drug leads and drug targets are shared freely with laboratories around the world. What's also unique about this organisation is it had industry funding, and over £80 million has been invested by a consortium of companies including Bayer, Janssen, Merck, Novartis, Pfizer, AbbVie and others, all at this drug discovery stage. And if you look around the circle here, there's a variety of outputs that are coming out of this. Not only new molecules, which can be shared with labs and tested, looking at biological activity, but also companies have been founded on this, and investment has come around in lots of different ways. The idea here is to speed up the pace of drug discovery as much as anything else. Now, the idea really is that you're crowdsourcing innovation, and Chaz will talk around this much more tomorrow. But the success of the SGC is it's created over 4,000 articles, and it's gone for difficult drug targets. It's not going for those targets that are particularly easy to actually go for. So you can look at areas like dementia, difficult rare diseases, all areas where the focus would be, rather than where industry and others are going. Now, there's a lot of investment in clinical trials has gone on in this area as well, so that this just shows that you have a potential to pull through from this drug discovery into the clinical arena. If you look at a typical R&D pathway that a drug developer will be doing, including large companies and SMEs, the numbers stack up fairly quickly. And you start out with target identification and validation. You're then going into generating lead molecules, optimizing those molecules, looking at biological activity to identify what disease areas you think you might be focusing on, and then going into phase 1 clinical trials on the back of a preclinical package which looks at toxicology and how the drug actually behaves. Phase 2A, phase 2B is where you're looking proof of concept, and then phase 3 are the large regulatory clinical trials, followed by submission to launch. If you look at that on the right-hand side, average duration 13.5 years, average cost per phase totals about $201 million. But actually, if you set that against all the drug failures and the rate at which they fail in development, probably an average cost per new molecular entity is about $1.8 to $2 billion. Numbers vary slightly for that. And then at the bottom, you can see the sort of failure rate at each different phase. So you could start out probably with 1 in 10,000 new molecules may actually eventually hit the market. Now, one of the questions is that if you're following an open source approach, no patents, how can you bridge a gap with the commercial universe? Why would companies want to invest, particularly in the expensive clinical trials phase, if they've got no patent protection to actually generate market exclusivity? And just to put this in slightly more context, If you look on the top level on the drug libraries, big data, using all of that to generate new, what we call, the SGC calls target enabling packages, where you've got actually well-formed molecules with quite a lot of data around it that are then used to identify biological activity. The idea with open innovation is you de-risk that, particularly in the research phase. But what if you were to extend the runway from research, lead optimization, actually into the clinic? Could you have an open access universe that will actually work in clinical practice in phase 1? So you're looking at proof of concept trials in humans with no IP protection. Now, on the face of it, most industry will probably laugh you out the room, so they weren't remotely interested, and this is a complete waste of time because they don't have any market exclusivity. Fair enough. The question, though, is, are there ways that you can look at the existing IP framework to make this possible? And if that's the case, what can you actually do to generate a better return on the investment and also de-risk those particular projects that you're working on? And one of the key things that the open innovation system is trying to do is to de-risk products. Can you actually generate more understanding of the biological activity, the different activity in different disease models, to actually give you a better likelihood of success in the clinic? How can you de-risk that as you go forward? And it's worth thinking about, even when you hit phase 3, you've got a 50% chance of failure. So that's a pretty big failure rate by all accounts. So about a year or two back, we got a group of interested people together to ask really a basic question, which was, is the absence of an all-encompassing patent portfolio begun before or during the medicinal chemistry phase in drug discovery incompatible with the ultimate requirement of a company for a significant degree of market exclusivity? So in short, will companies be interested where you've got an open innovation system? And we looked at 3 particular areas that we thought were relevant here. First was patenting strategies, the second was around data exclusivity, and the third was around orphan drugs. And each of these represents slightly different instruments and approaches to actually generating market exclusivity. So in patenting strategies, what we looked at was that the idea that a novel drug target would enter phase 1 with no IP coverage, and that the molecular structure and the biological activity would be in the public domain. So in pure patent terms, drug X intended for specific disease Y. And the question then is, how viable is it to go down a patenting route in this, given that you've got to demonstrate novelty, inventive step, and industrial applicability? And there's also the question of what you do around freedom to operate issues. Now, probably in the SGC universe, this is less of an issue because they're going after areas where industry doesn't generally look at, but that's still something that may be up for consideration. So it's pretty clear that trying to patent the drug, you can't do that because of prior propagation. The question then is, can you look at method of treatments or first or second medical use claims to support that? So drug X in a method of treating disease Y, or a method of treating disease Y in a subject comprising administrating that drug to the subject. It's possible, but publication of phase 1 clinical trials would probably make it very difficult to follow that type of pathway under current law or jurisprudence. So in short, with the drug or methods of treatments, it would be very difficult to get patent coverage. What else would you want to consider? Could you look at dosing regime? Would you do modified versions of the drug, use of the drug to treat a different disease, or combination therapies? Now, all of those have their limitations. Dosage regime would not give you strong IP protection. A modified version would mean you'd have to go back into these lead optimization, go through preclinical and clinical, then to demonstrate that you've actually got a different product. And then the use of the drug to treat a different disease, you'd still get no coverage on your originator disease that you're looking at. And similarly, combination therapies are challenging because of the costs associated with doing that. So all of that says that providing a scope of protection is not really feasible, and it's highly unlikely that a company would invest in downstream clinical trials based on an open system. What are the other things that you might think about in this? Could you, for example, follow a grace period? So that basically means that the publication by the inventors before a patent application would not constitute prior art. Normally it would be 1 year. Would this be sufficient under an open model? Probably not, because generally you'd actually have the publications of the biological data, and also the structure of the molecule you're taking will be several years before it hits the clinic. So this would not be viable. Could you look at petty patents, or what they call utility models, smaller systems for getting patent coverage? So what are the options in this way? Well, the only real option is you go back and develop a new model with sufficient variation in your structure-activity relationship to satisfy the criteria of patentability. So you're effectively going back to a lead optimization program. However, if you had funding to do that phase 1 clinical trial, one way or another, by hook or by crook as it were, ideally you'd have some data about the effectiveness of that drug in a clinical setting. And that would potentially de-risk the program going forward, and therefore you could justify going back to that lead optimization based on the information you've got out of the clinic. For industry and all of this, there's a distinct trade-off, which is the impact on drug development timeline versus the reduction in risk of your proof of concept in the clinical studies. And where would be a sweet spot, if at all, for industry in terms of understanding that risk versus the sort of timeline? The other question, though, in this is how broad will that protection be? Typically, it would be likely that your patent protection would be narrower because you wouldn't really be able to develop a layered portfolio that would operate and give you different timelines on that drug pathway and protection, and also would probably have an impact on the flexibility that you'd have around supplementary protection certificates going out post the elapsing of the patent timescale. So these are all things that need to be considered, and this is just one particular aspect you could look at, and I'm sure others, experts in the audience, will have different takes and views on this as well. The next area covers around data exclusivity, and in this it's been looking at the transition typically from a proprietary molecule into the generic sphere. So is there a particular situation, and this applies in Europe in particular, where you could get data exclusivity on your molecule in the clinic and thereby use that as a means for enforcing some market exclusivity? Now, I'm not an expert in this area, it's very complex and nuanced, but basically you're looking to a period when a second applicant for a marketing authorization, basically getting regulatory approval for a drug in Europe, or you can then use cross-refer to the preclinical and clinical data in the dossier of the originator product to support its application. What this effectively means is that the generics company would not have to go through a whole load of clinical testing to launch their generic product on the market. However, after the protection has lapsed, then second applicants, instead of producing their own data, can refer to that originator data. And in Europe, there's quite a lot of case law around this. And the idea really is you're balancing the interest between rewarding the innovators, limiting the unnecessary repetition of getting the clinical data, and the promotion of availability of cheaper generic products. So if you look at protection periods, for data exclusivity, during which period a company can't cross-refer to data from another MAA, it's 8 years. And there's also additional 2 years when you get an extra period where the generic cannot be placed on the market, even if it's got the MAA. For new indications, you also get an extra year. Now, there are constraints around this, and typically when you would look under an open innovation system, whether a company would actually want to risk the hundreds of millions of pounds investment on the back of this is open to some debate. You could also look at this in terms of new indications and getting extensions under that as well, which means that you get a little bit of extra time. But again, it's really the scope of the protection that you get that's a question mark here. The third area, and probably from a policy position, the easiest in terms of a home run, if you like, if you're looking at open innovation, is around orphan disease legislation. So both in the EU and the US, there's legislation that says that companies that will actually R&D and then market products for very, very small indications in terms of patient population, then they get a period of exclusivity which will prevent anybody else playing in the same space. So basically this is defined as life-threatening or chronic debilitating diseases affecting 5 out of 10,000 citizens or less. And typically if you look at the population, it's about 6% of the population is affected by 5 to 8,000 orphan diseases. And this was introduced in the year 2000. And basically, companies get a 10-year market exclusivity on the back of this. In the US, there's an equivalent but slightly different approach that's taken around the Office of Orphan Products Development. And again, there you're looking at around 200,000 persons. You can exceed that if you're not expected to recover the cost of developing and marketing a drug. So you've got a similar kind of system that's there, and there's also equivalents in some of the other major territories. In the US, you get a 7-year period of exclusivity, and you do also get clinical trial tax incentives. And it's interesting to look at the incentivization of this. And this data is about a year or so old, but up to about 2015, 2016, there were 600 products in clinical trials that had orphan drug designation. In cancer, because of the stratification that you can do then, there were more orphan opportunities, and that was a popular area. What is interesting in this is, and I'm not sure that the legislators quite anticipated this, is that the pricing of these drugs can be exceptionally high. So you're looking at $380,000 per annum for a very rare disease, Morquio A syndrome, which, you know, from the basis, most health systems would not be able to afford this. So that brings into questions around affordability. So if you look at the change between pre-83, 38, and then post-83, 420, this has been a very, very significant incentive to industry. And a number of companies have become very successful on the back of it. These are just a couple of examples. So this was originally done by Genzyme, which was then acquired by Sanofi, going back to 1991 and 1995. The market size of this at peak was $746 million. So it's not an inconsiderable opportunity there. And here's a similar one, Pulmozyme, which had market sales of $560 million in 2013 with expiry the following year. Now, what's quite significant in the orphan drug space is you tend to get off-label usage as well. And this has been an area where there's been concerns about actually increasing off-label usage in sort of unapproved indications also pushes up the drugs bill, which is also a challenge for health systems. Now, if you look at the market projections going out to 2018, you can see that the opportunities are significant in this. 6.9 billion for the lead product, Rituxan, and, you know, going down to over $1 billion products. So, you know, for companies, this has been a very attractive area, and this is all based on a market exclusivity model. Now, this, I think, also has some implications for personalised or precision medicine. If you're looking at stratifying patients into smaller and smaller cohorts, then you're going to fragment those larger indications, and you might come up then with more potential orphan indications, which would be beneficial if you're looking at it from an open innovation perspective. You get less competition, there's, you know, overall, whether it's from branded or generics rivals. You also get fast-track regulatory approval and lower cost late-stage development because your clinical trials are going to be slower and done in much smaller patient populations. The orphan drug market is set to reach about 127 billion by 2018, and it's 16% of total prescription drug sales. However, there remains, I think, challenges around the inconsistency between incentives to develop those drugs and the challenges around market access, pricing and reimbursement. And if you look at a lot of these things on a nice cost per quality basis here in the UK, it would be very, very difficult to get many of these through. Now, when we went through all of this, and in the reception desk, there's a write-up of this meeting. So if you're interested in finding out more details, there's a report there that we put together. And basically, it felt at that time that the opportunities for open access with advantages in terms of speed, sharing of information, probably a more rapid idea of biological activity, did not present an insurmountable obstacle to subsequent market exclusivity for the resulting product. So that's kind of where the position is that we got to in thinking about this. Chaz, Lee and I and others from the Office of Health Economics started to think about, well, how can you take this discussion forward? And most companies, when you talk about this kind of thing, are going to say, well, what's the return on investment? And most commercial departments you'd walk into, if you said no patents, they'd throw you out fairly quickly. So the only way you're actually going to demonstrate this in an industry basis is to understand the risk or versus the return on investment. So we were very fortunate last year to get some funding from the Oxford Martin School based here at the university to start exploring the relationship between IP, different R&D models, health economics around those models, and then different types of partnerships between industry, academic groups, clinicians, charities, and patient groups. And then start to look at, and this is what we're going to do, is to start to look at the different ways that the R&D models would impact those different stakeholder groups from the perspective of a health economic return on investment and what the IP implications are. In effect, what we want to do is to look at different R&D models. What would the R&D model in a closed system look like versus an R&D model in an open system or in a kind of a semi-open system if you had a consortium of, say, 5 to 8 pharmaceutical companies investing in that product being taken through into the clinic, and then each of them was free to take the results of that and develop their own drugs. What is interesting in this context is that despite the outputs of the Structural Genomics Consortium, you might think, well, no companies are going to take this forward. In fact, there's been probably 5 to 10 companies that have been developed on the back of the SGC outputs, and a number of those have already been sold for valuations in excess of £700 billion. And that's been done quite rapidly on the back of clinical data that's been generated. So it's not an insurmountable problem. The question is where you find the tension between the return versus the speeding up of the drug discovery. So the focus of what we're talking about ultimately is around affordable medicines, because also if you de-risk your product, you speed up the development pathway, then in an ideal world that should have an impact on your pricing and your health economic data that you generate to justify your cost per quality. So what we're going to look at is the different R&D models, who the stakeholders are, what are the alternative strategies to conventional intellectual property protection? I mean, are there other policy instruments that we could think about to consider that would give market exclusivity and incentivize open innovation into the clinic? Or basically, is all we've got what's available? The other key thing is what are the different R&D models for all stakeholders, and what are the scientific and societal benefits of these models? Now, this work you can't really do in isolation. So if we spent a couple of years doing this and then when knocked on the door of the pharmaceutical company and said, oh, jolly good, this is our thinking, they probably wouldn't be that interested. It's got to be a process we've got to co-create, get large companies, both R&D departments and commercial departments, engaged in understanding what the opportunities are here. There is also a significant bit that probably has to be done with investors. Venture capitalists won't like this because it's too risky. So what would be the investor's view on this? Would patient capital, which is really longer term investment, think about this in a slightly different way? So just to sort of finish up on, we're going to be looking at this over the next 2 years, and this is a sort of start of a journey, not the end of it. And we're really going to test the hypothesis, has the open innovation model got any legs taking things through into the clinic as an investment and a proposition actually to develop new drugs more rapidly and in much more challenging disease areas. So we'll look at alternative strategies for IP protection, the economic benefits, building new partnerships, and ideally, as we take this forward, to look at new funding and new initiatives that will support this around policy, what are the policy areas, and then optimization and adoption. So that's where we are. This is just what we sort of put out at the end of that meeting that we had, and my thanks also due to the people on the right who gave us significant intellectual property, intellectual thinking into this process. So thank you very much.